This is episode 22 of the Creator God theory of the Atonement. I've titled it, Creator God Suffers Penalty of the Law, with the subtitle, Christ Suffers a Temporal and Spiritual Death. Part 3. In our last episode, we built upon the Apostle Paul's declaration that the wages of sin is death, and emphasized the point that this death is fundamentally a condition, not a calculation. In other words, the wages of sin is not the cumulative sum of sins committed and corresponding suffering or penalties to be paid. Rather, sin, whether one sin or many, brings mankind into a state of misalignment with God and these eternal realities. This misalignment results in a fallen condition called death. Death is a state of temporal corruption and spiritual separation from God. This condition is woven into the very fabric of fallen creation itself. From within this captive condition, mankind has no power to escape. Fallen man, therefore, is both helpless and hopeless on his own. These distinctions are crucial for understanding our divine exchange model of the atonement, wherein the Creator God stands in place of his creation, taking upon himself the full consequence of the law, both temporal and spiritual death. The atonement is not a divine calculus of sins, penalties, and debts, but a divine descent into death itself, in order to redeem creation from within, thereby satisfying the demands of divine justice, while delivering mankind from the grasp of that awful monster, death and hell. Let me explain. In this understanding of the fallen condition of humanity as misalignment with God, it does not matter whether one commits one sin or many, the result is the same: temporal and spiritual death. As the scriptures affirm, God cannot look upon sin with the least degree of allowance. Each of us, therefore, regardless of personal character, intentions, or works, good or bad, fall under the full consequence of the law, death, both temporally and spiritually. In this divine exchange, Christ takes upon himself the condition of death, temporal and spiritual, on behalf of all humanity. His atoning death extends to all fallen creation for several reasons. First, because he is the Creator God, possessing the divine capacity and authority to encompass all creation within himself. Second, because it is not unjust for the Creator God to bear responsibility for his creations. And third, because the Creator God is infinitely greater than that which he has created. All of these principles have been established in our previous episodes. However, there is one additional and critical point that must be clarified. As Latter-day Saints commonly understand, mercy cannot rob justice. Therefore, Christ suffers the full penalty of the law on behalf of the repentant, while the unrepentant remains subject to the full penalty of the law themselves. As Alma instructs his son Corinthian, justice exerciseth all his demands, and also mercy claimeth all which is her own, and thus none but the truly penitent are saved. But if mercy cannot rob justice, and if Christ truly satisfies the full demands of divine justice on behalf of the repentant, then what does it actually mean for the Creator God to suffer the full penalty of the law? All of this, therefore, leads us back to Gethsemane and Calvary, into a series of profound questions. First, what does it truly mean for the Creator God to suffer the full penalty of the law, to suffer both a temporal and spiritual death? Second, what does it mean for the Creator God to deliver mankind from the grasp of that awful monster, death and hell? Third, what are we to make of Christ's cry upon the cross? My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Fourth, and what does it mean that, in his final moments, Christ declared, "It is finished," before yielding up his life? It is to these questions, and others like them, that we now turn. What does it truly mean for the Creator God to suffer the full penalty of the law, to suffer both a temporal and spiritual death? To begin answering that question, we must first recognize that the scriptures do not present temporal and spiritual death as entirely unrelated realities, but as two inseparably connected dimensions of one fallen condition brought upon mankind through sin and separation from God. Though distinct in form, they remain inseparably connected in source, condition, and consequence. Jacob describes them together as that awful monster, death and hell. Oh, how great the goodness of our God, who prepareth a way for our escape from the grasp of this awful monster, Yea, that monster, death and hell, which I call the death of the body, and also the death of the spirit. Notice carefully that Jacob does not speak of awful monsters, but of one awful monster, death and hell. This does not mean the death of the body and the death of the spirit are identical in every respect. The separation of body and spirit remains distinct from separation from the presence of God. Wherefore instructs Jacob, death and hell must deliver up their dead, and hell must deliver up its captive spirits, and the grave must deliver up its captive bodies, and the bodies and the spirits of men will be restored one to the other. Yet Jacob still speaks of them collectively as one awful monster, because both arise from the same fallen condition introduced through sin and the fall. Temporal death and spiritual death are therefore not isolated realities, but two manifestations of one fallen condition, mankind's captivity under corruption, separation, and death itself. Together they constitute the full condition from which humanity must be redeemed. This insight is profoundly important because it also helps us understand Gethsemane and Calvary correctly. These are not two disconnected acts of atonement, but one continuous descent of the Creator God into the full condition of death itself in both its temporal and spiritual dimensions. Gethsemane begins the descent. Calvary completes it. Taken together, they form one unified atoning sacrifice, wherein Christ suffers both temporal and spiritual death on behalf of fallen creation. At this point, however, this framework also allows us to perform what might be called a stress test for two competing models of the atonement. Within the divine calculus model, Christ's suffering is understood as a cumulative calculus of sin and penalty. Under this framework, the greater the number of sinners and sins, the greater the suffering required of Christ to satisfy divine justice. His suffering, therefore, expands proportionally as humanity's sins accumulate into an ever-increasing total. The atonement is thus understood as Christ absorbing and paying for the full aggregate of human sin, functioning as a potentially infinite accumulation of debt and its required satisfaction. We can then contrast this with the divine exchange model, wherein the Creator God suffers a temporal and spiritual death on behalf of His creations. Here the emphasis is not on accumulating individual sins into a total sum, but on the conditions sin produces, death itself, both temporal and spiritual. In this view, the atonement is not a mathematical accumulation of moral debts, but a divine exchange in which the Creator stands in place of His creations, and thereby undergoes the full consequence of sin, death itself, both temporal and spiritual. As the Creator God, He then breaks its power from within, thereby delivering mankind from that awful monster, death and hell. From here we can stress test both approaches, beginning with the divine calculus model. This model is grounded in the idea that justice requires payment of the uttermost farthing. In other words, to satisfy the demands of justice, nothing can remain unpaid. Every moral debt must be fully resolved, down to the last measure. Within this framework, Christ's suffering is tied to the accumulated total of all sins and sinners across humanity, past, present, and future. As we saw in previous episodes, this divine calculus of sins model ultimately led to philosophical problems such as backward causation, Calvinistic determinism, and the incoherence of a finite infinity. But here we are focusing on a different issue. Rather than asking how the model handles the largest possible accumulation of sin, we are asking whether it still works when reduced to its smallest possible case, one sinner with one sin. And more importantly, what does that mean if that one sinner is you? This is where the stress test becomes important. A model built on the accumulation of all sins can naturally shape the way we imagine the atonement. The individual may begin to feel like only a small part of a much larger moral system, making it easier to unconsciously think of one's sins as contributing only a tiny fraction to Christ's suffering and sacrifice. In that sense, a person may begin to feel connected to only a small portion of what took place in Gethsemane and on the cross, as though they were responsible for only part of what Christ suffered, rather than the full reality of the atoning sacrifice applying personally and completely to them. The question then is whether this model still fully works and remains personally meaningful when reduced to a single sinner and a single sin, or whether its logic depends mainly on the overwhelming magnitude of humanity's accumulated sins together. It is precisely at this point that the divine exchange model offers a fundamentally different starting point. Rather than beginning with accumulation, it begins with condition, death itself, both temporal and spiritual. In this model, even if there were only one sinner, with only one sin, the consequence would still be the same, temporal and spiritual death, for the wages of sin is death. Therefore, if Christ were to fully redeem that one person, he himself would still have to enter into the full reality of those two deaths on their behalf. This completely changes how we imagine the atonement. Rather than seeing ourselves as contributing only a tiny fraction to Christ's suffering among billions of others, we begin to realize that the full reality of what took place in Gethsemane and on the cross would still have been required to redeem us personally. This shows that Christ did not merely suffer some small portion for you. He entered fully into temporal and spiritual death in order to rescue you from that awful monster, death and hell. The results of this stress test bring us back more forcefully to our central question. What does it truly mean for the Creator God to suffer the full penalty of the law, temporal and spiritual death? We begin with what it means for the Creator God to suffer a temporal death before turning to his spiritual death, both of which are unified dimensions of one atoning sacrifice. In doing so, we need to keep three things in mind. Christ is both fully human and fully divine, for it is written, "For in him dwelleth all the fullness of the Godhead bodily." Because of this, he has full power over his temporal life. No man taketh it from me, but I lay it down of myself. And because he has power over his life in this way, he also possesses the capacity to suffer and endure beyond mortal limits, even more than man can suffer, except it be unto death. With this doctrinal foundation in place, we can now examine what it actually means for Jesus Christ, the Creator God, to suffer a temporal death. This is not simply the death of a mortal body, but the voluntary submission of the Lord of life to the condition of death itself. In other words, we are considering what it means for the one who holds power over life and death to nonetheless pass through the full reality of physical death on behalf of mankind. Yet this act is not only experiential, but also judicial. For the law declares that the wages of sin is death. In entering into temporal death, Christ therefore fully assumes the mortal condition brought about by the fall and satisfies the justice associated with physical death itself. Because Christ is both divine and embodied in mortality, his experience of suffering is not limited by ordinary human capacity. As King Benjamin declared, he would suffer even more than man can suffer, except it be unto death. This establishes a crucial point. Christ does not merely approach the limit of mortal suffering, he surpasses it. To help visualize this, we may use what we call a temporal suffering meter. This illustration represents the full range of mortal experience, from mild discomfort to severe suffering, to excruciating pain, and finally to death itself, where the body fails, and suffering ends in the separation of the spirit from the body. This final breaking point marks the death threshold, beyond which no mortal man can endure without succumbing. Within this framework, three truths must be kept in view. Christ has power over death. He lays down his life willingly. No man takes it from him. Christ endures beyond what man can suffer. Wherever humanity falls on this scale, Christ goes farther. He passes beyond the full limit of mortal suffering, meaning there is no point within human experience that lies outside his comprehension, compassion, or ability to succor. What does this mean? It means Christ can fully succor every person at every level of suffering imaginable, no matter how mild or how extreme, because he has already gone beyond the furthest threshold of mortal endurance. This understanding is powerfully confirmed by Alma the Younger in the Book of Mormon. And he shall go forth, suffering pains and afflictions and temptations of every kind, and this, that the word might be fulfilled, which saith, he will take upon him the pains and the sicknesses of his people, and he will take upon him death, that he may loose the bands of death which bind his people. And he will take upon him their infirmities, that his bowels may be filled with mercy according to the flesh, that he may know according to the flesh how to succor his people according to their infirmities. This passage, along with many others like it, describes the temporal dimension of Christ's suffering in concrete terms, including pains, afflictions, temptations, sicknesses, infirmities, weaknesses, grief and sorrow, physical suffering, the condition of mortality itself, including death. The purpose of the temporal suffering meter is therefore not merely to show that Christ suffered extensively, but that he fully transcended the limits of mortal experience. Because of this, he is able to perfectly understand, succor, and sustain every form of human suffering without exception. This point is crucial. It does not require that Christ individually experience every pain, sickness, or affliction that every person has ever endured. Such a model would collapse into philosophical difficulties already discussed, requiring exhaustive pre-enactment of all future suffering, and thus leading toward backward causation, determinism, and an incoherent accumulation of infinite moral experience. Instead, the scriptural witness is simpler and more profound. Christ surpasses the mortal threshold itself. Because he has gone beyond what man can suffer, there is no degree of temporal suffering beyond his comprehension or compassion. Whatever any human being experiences within mortality, Christ has already gone farther. Now, this does not diminish divine knowledge, for the Spirit knoweth all things. Rather, the emphasis is that Christ came to experience these realities, according to the flesh, that he may know, according to the flesh, how to succor his people according to their infirmities. This is not abstract omniscience alone, but lived mortal experience, pain, weakness, and suffering fully entered into within mortality, so that he might truly succor his people from within their condition. This leads us back to the full significance of temporal death. Christ not only enters mortality and suffers within it, he also fulfills the justice of the law itself. By voluntarily submitting to physical death, he fully enters the condition described by the wages of sin is death, thereby satisfying the temporal demands of justice. Yet, as we will later see, his entrance into death is not only submission, it is also the beginning of its overthrow. This leads us to our next question. What does it actually mean for Jesus Christ, the Creator God, to suffer a spiritual death? Which suffering caused myself, even God, the greatest of all, to tremble because of pain and to suffer both body and spirit. To help set the stage for what it means for Jesus Christ, the Creator God, to suffer a spiritual death, that is, to be cut off completely from the presence of God, consider the following imagery. Imagine a man leaving a darkened cave where there is no light and walking directly into the brightness of the noonday sun. The contrast between darkness and light would be overwhelming, so intense that it would temporarily blind him until his eyes gradually adjusted to the brightness. Now consider the opposite scenario. A man leaving the brightness of the noonday sun and walking directly into a pitch-black cave. The contrast in this direction would be even more severe. The darkness itself would feel blinding, yet unlike the first scenario, there would be no light within the cave for his eyes to gradually adjust to. He would remain swallowed in darkness. Likewise, spiritual death is not merely a matter of darkness alone, but of the intensity of the contrast between the light possessed and the separation entered into. The greater the light and truth one possesses, the greater the anguish experienced when cut off from that light. This is what makes the suffering of Jesus Christ unique, because he possessed not merely mortal light, but a fullness of divine light and truth as the Creator God. His entrance into spiritual death involved a contrast and anguish beyond mortal comprehension. Now imagine that it were possible to graph this transition from light into darkness upon a chart. The experiences of mortal mankind might appear as a continuous series of smaller waves, rising and falling at varying levels of contrast and intensity. Some would represent only mild spiritual loss or alienation, while others would reflect profound anguish, despair, guilt, abandonment, or separation from God. Yet towering above all of these would stand one incomparably greater wave, rising sharply upward and extending beyond the limits of the chart itself, representing the contrast experienced by Jesus Christ, the Creator God, in descending from a fullness of divine light and truth into the spiritual darkness and death associated with separation from God the Father's presence. Because he possessed a fullness of divine light and truth as the Creator God, his entrance into separation from the Father involved a spiritual contrast and anguish, surpassing all mortal experience, enduring what the New Testament describes as such contradiction of sinners against himself. As the Lord himself declared, this suffering caused myself, even God, the greatest of all, to tremble because of pain and to bleed at every pore and to suffer both body and spirit. From this illustration, we begin to see the central point. Christ did not need to experience individually every specific spiritual condition of every human soul in order to fully understand, redeem, and succor them. Just as he did not need to experience separately every physical pain or infirmity in order to surpass the full threshold of mortal suffering, so likewise, there was no need for him to experience individually every possible state of spiritual darkness or alienation. By descending through a far greater spiritual contrast than fallen mankind could ever endure, he entered fully into the reality of spiritual death itself. Now imagine placing you and me somewhere upon this spiritual contrast chart. Each of us has experienced some measure of guilt, despair, temptation, alienation, spiritual blindness, abandonment, or darkness within this fallen condition. Yet notice where Christ's experience stands, towering far above our own. Does it not then make sense that Christ would be able to fully understand, relate to, and succor us within our own condition of spiritual separation from God? Therefore, there is no depth of spiritual anguish, darkness, or alienation into which mankind can fall that lies beyond his understanding, compassion, or power to redeem, lift, and bring us back into the presence of the Father. We have now completed our examination of the first great question. What does it truly mean for the Creator God to suffer the full penalty of the law, to suffer both a temporal and spiritual death? In the next and final episode of this four-part series, we will turn to the culminating questions of the atonement itself. What does it mean for the Creator God to deliver mankind from the grasp of that awful monster, death and hell? What are we to make of Christ's cry upon the cross? My God, why hast thou forsaken me? And what does it mean that in his final moments, Christ declared, "It is finished," before yielding up his life? We invite you to join us for part 4 of this series as we return once more to Gethsemane and Calvary to explore the final triumph of the Creator God over death, hell, and the powers of darkness through his suffering, death, resurrection, and ascension back into the presence of the Father.